Well, have you heard any of the following comments made before about Christians? Number one, Christians are just so heavenly minded. They are not paying attention or don't care about what happens on this earth. It's almost like they've forgotten about what happens here because they're just focused on the next life. Two, Christians are so one issue focused. All they care is about sexuality or abortion. They don't care about poverty and human needs around the world because all they care about are these simple things or these one or two things. Or number three, have you heard this? That Christian theology is actually destructive, oppressive, hateful, bigoted, homophobic, transphobic, whatever it may be. And that actually this idea of Christian theology, Christian beliefs, the world would be better if Christianity was gone. It's an outdated, oppressive, bad system, and the world would be a better place if Christianity was no more. Maybe you've heard one of those. Maybe you haven't. Maybe you clicked on those because clicked on this video because you're like, hey, that is something I have heard. Well, if that's you, and if you've heard anything like this, then I do want to address these topics and these questions today. We're going to do it by looking at this booklet, and I'm going to tell you more about it here in just a second. But my name is Ryan Pauly, and this is the show Think Well, a show that is designed to get you to think well about the Christian faith, think well about culture, and then how do we engage it well? And so trying to come alongside you and have conversations about some of the most pressing cultural issues, as well as apologetic and theological issues, so that you are prepared to respond well when challenges come your way. And as always, I want to respond to you and I want to model that kind of conversation. And so if you're listening and you have questions or objections, you can always post those ahead of time. You can send them to me on YouTube or on Instagram at RyanPauly3 is my handle there. Or you can join live during the conversation. Post your questions in the live chat, either on Instagram or on YouTube. Or you can use the link that I just posted in the live chat and you can join the conversation and talk to me live about your questions. And so I'd love to have that sort of conversation with you and think through the things that are important and think through the things that are pressing on your mind. And so that's what we're going to do today, starting off with this conversation and then getting to your questions. One question has already come in on why does it seem like God is so hidden? So this argument from divine hiddenness and how do we respond to that? So the book that we're going to start with is this book right there. So for Instagram, now you can see it. Is Christianity Good for the World by Sharon James. And this is actually part 2 of a little series. This is put out by Crossway Publishing, part of the TGC Hard Questions series. And again, this is a topic of is Christianity good for the world? This is a topic that I've studied. This is a topic I lecture on when I go to different churches or conferences or youth groups and talk about the impact that Christianity has had on the world. And so with topics that I've studied a lot and lecture on, I'm always looking for good resources to recommend on the topic. And so when I saw that Crossway was publishing this TGC Hard Questions series, last time with the book on what does God say about gender identity, and now this week on this book, is Christianity Good for the World, I asked them if I could have a copy. So they graciously gave me a copy in exchange for an honest feedback and review for the book. And so that is what we're going to be talking about here. But really quickly about this little booklet. If you missed the last one, one thing I like about these booklets is they're short. This one is like 39 pages. I think the last one was 44 pages. And so that's where the booklet ends. All of this is additional resources, reading, footnotes. There's a ton of research in this book. In 39 pages, there are 95 footnotes or endnotes. And so there's a ton of research, very well written and concise, and is really going to deal with a lot of issues that we are going to talk through here in just a moment. Now, again, the author, Sharon James, has a PhD from the University of Wales and works as a social policy analyst for the Christian Institute in the United Kingdom, and has written a number of books and has traveled to many countries as a conference speaker, and she writes at sharonjames.org. So it's a PhD person who works a lot with policy and analysis from a Christian institute. So there's a little bit about the author. But this book is kind of broken up, and why I titled the video the way that I did, it's broken up into little sections. There are 3 main sections on this idea of human freedom, human flourishing, and human fulfillment. And really is going to look at this question of, is Christianity good for the world? And going to compare the Christian worldview and what it has to say about freedom to what we've seen in secular cultures or non-religious cultures or even other religious cultures on how they have encouraged or not encouraged this idea of human freedom. What does it say about flourishing? How do we flourish as humans? And then ultimately, how are we fulfilled? And she's going to take this kind of line of reasoning and break it down into those 3 categories to help see that Christianity really is good for the world. And so that's what we're talking about here. So to kind of jump in, as I mentioned, if you've spent any amount of time online, I'm assuming that you've heard one of those three things I started with, that either Christians are so heaven-minded that they don't do any good here, that Christians are so one-issue focused that they don't really focus on things that really matter, or even that Christians hold theological views that are destructive. And so the world would really be better, in a better place, if Christianity was not around anymore, if it was done away with. And so the question is there truth to this? Is there truth to this is how Christians have been, or how Christians are, or what Christianity teaches? And I think that what I want to communicate to you and give you a lot of examples is that the ideals of justice, of freedom, and of compassion are based in a biblical worldview. Right? What we have to do is we have to recognize the difference between how Christians act and what Christianity teaches. Right? We're not going to judge Christianity as an evil thing if it teaches you to love your neighbor as yourself, and then Christians are being mean and hateful towards individuals. We could say, hey, you are inconsistent, you are hypocritical. In fact, this is how the world looks. Sharon starts off by quoting research that cites that Gen Z teens say hypocrisy is among Christianity and Christians is a barrier to believing, right? That you've probably heard this before, and people say it all the time, that this idea of Christians being hypocrites is like one of the main adjectives used to describe Christians is hypocritical. And this is actually then people say is a barrier to us believing. And so what we as Christians should hopefully recognize in this is that what Christianity calls us to is a standard of living that is hard, but one that is unique, one that calls us to be really radical in how we live. And if we live consistently to a biblical worldview, it really does produce and creates ideas of justice, freedom, flourishing, compassion, and fulfillment that our world does really desire and long for. And so I think we have to recognize that. Sharon also goes on to talk about top commentators. Both Christian and non-Christian commentators argue that the rejection of a biblical worldview has catastrophic effects on Western culture. As Christian morality is rejected, sexual exploitation and abuse escalates. And so what we recognize is, again, one of these core foundational principles of a biblical worldview is to serve others. Right? That's one thing that Jesus came and taught, is how to love and to serve, to put others before yourself. Do not care about your own interests, but put the interests of others above yourself. And so again, if we are living this out, if we are living truly to what the Christian worldview teaches, there should be something different about us. Now, is that always the case? No, it's not. We all are falling short, and there's ways in which our sinful nature gets the best of us. But the issue, or the question, or the point here is that should at least be the desire that we as Christians have. So the first thing that she talks about is this idea of freedom. And she breaks this down into how freedom is often attacked in a godless world. She looks at then the Christianity provides a foundation for freedom, or at least the Christian foundation of freedom. Then how Christian or religious freedom is rooted in biblical truths. This then led to the opposition of slavery. This led to missions work, going and doing amazing stuff because of what the higher calling that Christians have. And so just to kind of look at a few of the points here that she mentioned, is this idea of Christianity providing a foundation for freedom. Like we have in our culture this idea where we want to be free. People want to be free, and they want to choose to do the things that they want to do, and we don't like being controlled, enslaved, or oppressed by people who are above us. And she says here, quote, "The idea of human rights is founded on a biblical view that all people are created in God's image." Right? We read in Genesis 9, verse 6, that because God is the giver of life, that he will judge the shedding of innocent blood. And also in Romans 13, that we are going to give account to God for all the things that we do. And so we recognize this idea of this fundamental freedom is grounded in the aspect, or in the belief, the view that all people are created in the image of God and are valuable, have dignity, value, and worth. And so we have to take a step back, because this did come in on Facebook. If I can pull this up here really quick, is the question is Christianity, is the biblical worldview the only way that we can ground human equality? Is it the only way that we can ground true human freedom? And I think the question that we have to look at here, as I pull up this point, where is it? No, that's not it. Sorry, guys. But the thing that I think we have to look at here is this idea of, do we see this taking place? Do we see this happening in other views, in other systems, in other cultures, in other religions? Like, I mean, throughout all of human history, it was very common to see this idea of people being taken advantage of the weaker being oppressed. And so we recognize that Christians have played out a disproportionately large role in advancing religious freedom and universal rights and freedoms to all people. And also this idea within Christianity that our freedom to change is voluntary. It should not be forced on anybody. Because there's this, again, a foundational principle of this idea of liberty of the conscience. Your freedom of conscience is a natural right that God created us to think and believe as we want to think and believe. So I want to read for you a quote that is out of one of my old high school textbooks that I used to teach through, Understanding the Culture, published by Summit Ministries by Dr. Jeff Myers. I want to read to you a section, one paragraph from this that talks about why religious freedom is important to Christians. And it's also not just I want freedom as a Christian, but religious freedom is maybe more broadly understood as this freedom of conscience to believe what you want to believe. Here's what Dr. Jeff Myers writes. To live in dignity, people must be able to follow the leading of their conscience. If we're coerced into saying we believe something we don't, our integrity is violated because we're being forced to lie. If we're compelled to refrain from acting on what we do believe, we can't live authentically. In either case, truth, honesty, trust, creativity, and thought all suffer. Rights that protect the body, but not the mind, fail to account for what it means to be human. We must be free in our minds in order to be truly free. In this sense, the right to religious freedom is the most basic right of all. And again, he's defining religious freedom here as this idea that says the universal right of human beings to think, live, and worship as they feel convicted by their religious beliefs without the fear of persecution. Right now, obviously, there are limits to that where you can't say and do whatever you want to do. But this idea that is founded in Christian theology and in Christian doctrine, not always practiced, but is found in it, is we should not be forcing our views on other people because then we cannot live authentically. It's not about bashing people over the head with a Bible and getting them to believe what you want. It's not through threat of a sword or punishment. And some people look at Christianity like that. See, I think there's a lot of people that look at Christianity as being an evil thing based on this understanding that Christians have on the nature of hell, right? That it's kind of is this threat of punishment and I'm threatening you to believe something. I think the difference there is not I'm threatening you, I'm going to kill you unless you believe sort of thing that we've seen practiced in Christianity and other religions where it's spread through the sword. But the nature of hell, if you actually look at it from a Christian view, is not a threat, it's a reality. Right? It's the same as a doctor who says you have cancer and if you don't do cancer treatment, you're going to die. You don't say, why are you threatening me? The doctor is pointing out a reality that is true and giving you a solution to it. And so I think we have to recognize Christians that one of the founding principles that we see here is this ultimate desire or this ultimate, we are created to be free. And this is a freedom of our conscience. This is a religious freedom that has led to Christians playing a disproportionately large role in advancing freedoms for people around the world. And so we see this played out hugely in this goal to end and abolish slavery. Where yes, did some Christians hold slaves and advocate for slavery? Yes. But we have many Christians, including ex-slaves, who resisted and sacrificed in order to end the slave trade. Now, when we look at this, there's one study that Sharon posted here or cited that said that there's more slaves in the world today. I guess I'm jumping ahead of myself because I don't see it right here. There's more slaves in the world today than there almost ever has been, like 27.6 million around the world, whether it's sex slavery, human trafficking, or that nature. And we also saw slavery as like a foundational, like a building block in many other societies. And so the question is, have we seen cultures push hard against slavery, against the oppression and objectification of individuals apart from a biblical worldview? Or is it within this understanding of a biblical worldview that we see this greater respect for human individuals, and therefore this fight to get people free and this desire for them to be free? And so she mentions here that individual freedom and rights are most prevalent where Christianity has had the greatest effect. And so here's just an interesting thing to kind of think about is, where do you see individual human rights, individual liberties, and freedoms most prevalent? And she's arguing here and citing a source to show that this is where Christianity has actually had a huge impact on those societies. Again, there's non-Christian historians, like Thomas Holland, who wrote Dominion, not Spider-Man, the historian, and others who have argued the same thing, that the vast majority of good things that we see in our culture is coming from this Judeo-Christian ethic, this Christian worldview, this biblical worldview. We also recognize that within this idea of being free, that there's this understanding of justice. We want justice to be done in our culture. And we see that justice is not always done in this life, but there will be justice done in a Christian worldview where there is an ultimate justice. And so we see this freedom that people have desired, that cultures often desire. We see this in a greater sense within cultures that are really impacted and affected by a Christian worldview. Again, this idea that God created us to have a freedom of mind, to not be coerced, to not be forced, to not be punished, to not be objectified or enslaved, but really to live out the life that God has created us and called us to live. So that's the first kind of thing that she looks at. This understanding of freedom really does stem from a biblical worldview. So again, what I couldn't find on Facebook a moment ago, but the question is like, okay, yeah, Christianity clearly teaches this, but you can get it from other places. The question is, what founding principles do we see in other worldviews, other religions, or other cultures that really have led to these changes? Or do we see that changes really are stemming from cultures that have been impacted and influenced by Christianity? The second thing that Sharon talks about is this understanding of flourishing. And I keep looking down because I have my book here. I'm finding quotes, but that what we've seen throughout Christian history, and again, this isn't perfectly true of every Christian who has ever lived, but generally, believers have not only cared for their own, but also for neighbors and strangers. Right? We see that taught clearly in Scripture, like with the Good Samaritan, right? It's not just caring about your own person, but caring about people who are strangers, caring about people who are not just your family. And we recognize what Christ has done for us, and this should impact and change us. And so we see these accusations that Christians are accused of being blind to suffering around the world, or blind to certain injustices that are taking place, because again, we're just so focused on the next life that we don't actually think about what's happening now. But what we have to recognize, and one thing that Sharon points out here, is that those who are most assured of heaven are often the most willing to risk death in the service of others. And we see examples of this all throughout human history, where the people who are like, no, I know where I'm going. My salvation is secure. I am confident. I know what's happening to me in the end. Therefore, I don't have to fear death. Looking at that kind of 1 Corinthians 15, oh, death, where is your sting? Oh, death, where is your victory? Then we can say, look, now I can step into these places to care and serve for individuals in ways that maybe I wouldn't if I have this belief system that says, you only live once. This is the only life that I have to live, therefore make the most of it. And so there is a fundamental question that maybe we can think and consider, is if this world is all that there is, if this life is all that there is to live, and there is no afterlife, what reason would I have to risk my life, to possibly end my life, to help someone else, when that's going to end the only life that I have? Versus in a Christian view, if I'm going to live for eternity somewhere else, and this life really is just a small blip on the radar in perspective of all of eternity, and I know that my eternity is set, then by risking my life to help someone, I'm not losing anything, because I have all of eternity in front of me. But if this life is all that I have, putting my life on the line for someone else, I'm risking everything. I'm risking all that there is left. Then you could argue, well, it's for glory, it's for fame, it's for whatever. But again, if this life is all that there is, I'm ultimately not going to be remembered. And so why try this? Now, Clay Jones, there's a book behind me on the back called, by Clay Jones called Immortality, I think is what it's called. This idea that everyone has this immortality project. Everyone is trying to be immortal. They're trying to live forever. And you live forever by getting your name on a building. And so everyone will remember you, or you live forever in your family's memories or something of that nature. And the question is, what ultimately will get us to live forever? There's only one true immortality. And I think you can argue that those who have that true immortality and have knowledge of where they're going actually are the most willing to risk death in service of others. And so because of this, we have seen Christians have pity for the poor and the weak, regardless of what others say. In other cultures throughout human history, like ideas of like charity and help were vices, not virtues. Why would you pity them? It's their fault. We see other cultures that have views of karma that, well, they're just getting what they deserve, so don't help them. They deserve this because of what they've done in some sort of previous life or this life. Versus a Christian worldview comes along and says, no, we actually believe in caring for those who are poor and helping those who are sick and hurting and who are outcast and down. How do we do this perfectly? No. But when you look at charities around the world, many are grounded or funded by Christianity. That Christianity has this huge impact. In fact, Christians have established hospitals. Right? There's stories of great plagues where everyone is running around away from the plague, trying to save their own life. The Christians stepped in and ended up dying to try to save and to try to help people. Christians starting and running orphanages, not saying, hey, you're just a young kid, you're worthless to society, and so let you pass. But really this idea of, no, you're a human being created in the image of God. Let me help you and let me try to find this place for you to have a family, to be welcomed ultimately to the family of God, but in an earthly family as well. Christians starting hospice ministries and a bunch of other stuff. And so we see here that she even lists other aspects of evangelical Christians being responsible for a remarkable range of social advance, prison reform, care for the mentally ill, factory reform, and rescuing women and children from sexual abuse, and a provision of education. Right? These things that we recognize are good things for. It's Christians living out a biblical worldview grounded in what God has called them to do that are living these things out well. She writes here that a lot of if you go to like, she says here, let me just find it really quick. She says the authors of this book, Half the Sky, How to Change the World, are liberal feminists, and even they testify that when you travel to the poorest countries in Africa, you find aid workers around cities. But in the remote areas where help is most needed, you find missionary doctors and church-sponsored aid workers. While the aid workers and diplomats come and go, only the missionaries stay for life. And now here's the other thing that I thought was interesting on this point is that while secular liberals decry social injustice, they often merely lobby governments to give aid. Christians more often give generously themselves. Now, I don't have the numbers here, and I probably should have found this study, but I remember reading studies of just in general, statistically, Christians giving a lot more financially to help the poor and these sort of programs that really come alongside those who need help than non-religious people give. And so again, here's something interesting to think through is that when Christians are very vocal online about some sort of injustice, to automatically assume that means that why don't you care about X, Y, and Z? It's maybe they do care, but they care in a way in which you don't really see. I remember having a conversation with someone where, seeing how much I talk to like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. And the question was like, well, why do you spend so much time debating theology? Why don't you do something actually good for society? Why don't you help poor or these sort of things? Why do you just sit here and argue about whose view of God is right? And I remember someone else jumping into that conversation and saying, do you realize how much money my church gives to build wells around the country and to support families who are in need and help people pay off electrical bills and help with education and all this kind of stuff? And it was in the millions of dollars. See, I think we have to recognize and kind of give people the benefit of the doubt that while they may be public about one thing online, posting and really upset about one thing, to then assume that they don't care about X, Y, and Z. We don't know that, because Christians often are not publicly, most Christians I don't see are publicly posting about every single nonprofit organization that they support and then how much they support that organization for. And so you may have Christians that are giving to cover medical expenses and giving, like there's amazing Christian ministries that help cover people's medical bills. And so just to assume that Christians, because they don't believe in maybe a government funded free medical care for everybody type of system, to say they automatically don't care about covering people's medical bills is a jump that is not often supported by that evidence. Because again, there are Christian funded organizations that come along and help people out of medical debt. And there's really cool stories of this. And so I think we just maybe need to take a step back, and rather than assuming the worst about people because of what they post online, say, man, I'm not aware of all the things that they care about. I'm not aware of all the things that they're doing. And maybe there's more behind the scenes that I don't actually see. And so I think this is important when we kind of think through this idea of how Christians are responding in compassionate ways that really is revolutionary when we look around the world and throughout all of human history. As I mentioned briefly, this idea of education is a huge way in which Christians have had a massive positive impact on the world. Sharon quotes here, she says, Western missions birthed, financed, and nurtured hundreds of universities, thousands of colleges, and tens of thousands of schools. They educated millions and transformed nations. Living standards are raised when people apply their God-given reason to innovate, work, and solve problems. Education is essential to this process. So again, I know tons of Christians that are giving away a lot of scholarship money for people to go get education. And I was a part of this. When I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, I ran a child sponsorship program where a school that I was over was a school for Haitian refugee children. And we had people sponsoring about 60 students at this school where they were being fed a hot meal every single day and receiving education. Because we recognize that one way in which cultures and people oppress is through not letting people learn and keeping them down through not allowing their God-given mind to be put to use where they can innovate and work and build a life for themselves. And so Christians massively support education programs as well as schools and universities to help people develop skills that then allow them to glorify God. And those skills then get put back into practice that do amazing and good things for the world. And so again, when I had, people challenge me of like, why do Christians thank an atheist doctor for healing them? It's like, well, first of all, where did the hospital system even come from? Why do we have this idea that it's good to heal people rather than just let them die and let kind of, survival of the fittest play out? And where did that person even get their mind? And where did they get the education to learn how to bring healing to people's bodies? Right? The education involved, the hospital system involved, and just the compassion element involved is not only grounded in a biblical worldview, but it's all happening within a world that God has created for valuable human beings to where it becomes good to heal them rather than to discard them. And so this is why we thank God, but also we recognize the biblical underpinning, the biblical foundation for these practices, even if it is an atheist doctor who was playing it out. We also recognize, and she mentions here, the scientific revolution and how Christians really kind of laid the foundation for that. And not only then with the scientific revolution but also just innovations, where she talked about horseshoes and crop rotations and eyeglasses and all of these different innovations that have improved the life for so many people, but have Christian convictions that laid the foundation for these sort of improvements. And so really we recognize that this flourishing that we experience, as she's arguing, it does stem from a biblical worldview, to where if we say, okay, let's remove a Christian worldview from our culture, what would be the foundational principle for why we should want others to flourish? Now, I'm not saying this is every atheist ever, but a lot that I've talked to, those who hold to some sort of objective morality, objective right and wrong, will fall back something into the sort of it's based on human flourishing, that human flourishing is a objective good, and therefore we should want to cause and help human flourishing. The question, though, is what makes human flourishing an objective good? Why not let people kind of just suffer? Why not let people die? And again, we saw that throughout many cultures. Now, she gets to this question here of kind of the environment and human flourishing, where she talks about that the biblical conviction is that humans created in God's image should all have an opportunity to flourish. And in a post-Christian world or in a non-Christian world, we have seen examples. For example, in 1920, a book titled Allowing the Destruction of Life, Unworthy of Life, it was published in Germany. Those with brain injuries, intellectual disabilities, psychiatric illnesses were described as having lives not worth extending. She quotes today in many Western countries that view humankind as the product of random mutation and natural selection. So the question is, if I am just the result of an evolutionary process of genetic mutation and natural selection, why am I worth saving? What makes humans worth doing something special? Why not let those who have the wrong genetic mutation or corrupted genetic mutations that give them some sort of illness or disease or injury, just let them go because there is a mistake in that genetic mutation, like we see computer code. If the computer code that you have is not functioning well, you discard it, you fix it, you do whatever it has to have because it's broken. And she says, that we saw in U.S. Supreme Court decisions from the 1992. She quotes, in 1992, a majority of U.S. Supreme Court justices ruled that the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. But that implies that we, not God, decide when human life begins and which lives are worth protecting. So she quotes here that worldwide abortion kills 73 million unborn children every single year. 73 million worldwide, right? She gives a quote here that in Canada, poor and homeless have been affected or offered medical help to die. So then talking about other places with active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, that it's often cheaper to kill someone or allow them to die or help them die, have death with dignity, as some will call it, rather than try to save them. She talks about people... a French activist from the early from 1932 to 2020, so he recently just passed, who argued that humans consume too many of nature's resources and at most should have been killed. I wrote in one of my research papers, let me grab my other laptop here, citing a source on environmentalism source, specifically on deep ecology. That one deep ecologist argued that the human population must be substantially reduced in order for us to be able to survive our environmental problem. And this one ecologist said the desirable amount of humans would be 100 million. Others argue 1 to 2 billion would be best. But recognize if someone's saying, hey, we need to reduce human population, we are too many, the desirable amount is 100 million, then they're talking about if our human population right now is like 8 billion, we're talking about reducing 7.9 billion people. Did I do my math right on the top of my head? Right? This is not a view that says humans are valuable, worthy of dignity, should be protected, and now we need to use our mind to innovate, to figure out ways to sustain our planet and to be faithful stewards. It's like, hey, let's just eliminate humans. Let's eliminate people, and that will solve our problem. And so we recognize this stemming from other views, that respect for every human life, as Sharon says, did not arise from other world religions or from secularism. It arose from a biblical conviction that God created man and woman in his own image. This is the foundation for freedom, for flourishing, and also, as we will see, for fulfillment. So this is the last section. I'm almost done with my comments, and I'll get to divine hiddenness and whatever other questions that you have. Post them in the live chats or call in using that link that I posted. But she talks about this idea of human fulfillment that many people believe. that fulfillment means being able to enjoy all the pleasures of this life. And therefore, kind of that third point I mentioned, that this Christian theology that says sex between one man and one woman inside the context of marriage is the only appropriate way, that God is this cosmic killjoy trying to ruin our fun. And so we want this freedom to be able to do whatever we want to do. The problem is this freedom that we desired has not allowed us to flourish. It has not allowed us to have ultimate fulfillment. And we have seen that this trying to make sex casual and this just, hey, it's like any other activity, it has led to exploitation and abuse and coercion and abortion and infanticide, and a lot of different issues have stemmed from rejecting or challenging a biblical view of sexuality. And so we recognize a significant factor of growing and flourishing is an appeal to Christian ethics. And we saw this in early Roman culture as well, where they didn't really have do's and don'ts, or at least they weren't really that important. And the Christians come along and it's like, no, what you believe actually matters, and what you do should be influenced and impacted by what you believe. This was attractive to the early church in first century Rome. We also recognize that when you live according to God's design, that is when flourishing happens. And I use this illustration all the time, but if you're a first-time listener or watcher, then you haven't heard it, right? But it's like, here's my coffee mug. If I use my mug on how it was designed to be used, it will last longer. It will do what it was made to do, and it will function well. But if I'm like, hey, it seems kind of sturdy, let's use it as a hammer, rather than enjoying a good Ethiopian coffee, you're going to destroy it. It is going to cause its destruction. So we recognize that when we reject the way that God has designed us to live, it does not lead to our flourishing or our fulfillment. Sharon quotes here, or Sharon says here, and I quote, "Young women are told that casual sex is empowering. They are the losers in a hookup culture, which delivers loveless sex, humiliating abuse, and miserable abandonment. While there are individual exceptions, on average, women and children are safer within the married family than anywhere else." And so we recognize this idea of when we see moral codes as being oppressive, as we see moral codes as limiting my freedom because I can't do the things that I want to do, and therefore I need to remove all of those moral codes and to truly be free and live the way that I want to do. Again, we talked about freedom first. It's a mistaken view of freedom to say the only type of freedom is freedom to do whatever I want, freedom from restrictions. There's also a freedom to do what you were made to do. Then we recognize that's when flourishing and fulfillment come. When we depersonalize and dehumanize sex, as many young people are told, it's just like any other recreational activity. Why is it then that so many people end up feeling used, abused, and betrayed? Right? These are huge factors that we see are hurting people around us. And you don't have to look far to see this idea really impacting people in personal ways. And so Sharon ends by giving kind of a bullet point list of just sort of some things that the Christian worldview provides that really does make the Christian worldview good for our world. So let me read the bullet point list really quickly, and then I'll be done. I'll jump to your questions. Number one, the only solid foundation for human dignity. We've all been created in the image of God. So again, if you want to push back against that, I'd be happy to hear what are the other solid foundations for human dignity. But I think that really is maybe the only solid foundation. Number two, the only firm defense for human unity. We are all descended from the same first parents. Number three, the only solid foundation for real freedom. No government has the authority to tell us what to think. We will answer to God. So true freedom is found in doing what God has called us to do. Number four, the only solid foundation for morality. The perfectly just and righteous God has given every one of us a conscience and awareness of his moral law. And so we have this conscience built in. Where do we understand this conscience from a secular view? If I'm just, chemicals in motion, where do we understand this conscience from and consciousness from? It doesn't make sense. I think that's one of the big arguments for God, is an argument from consciousness. The next one, the only sure way of human flourishing. Family, work, and civil authorities have been affected by sin, but they are God's provision for our good. And lastly, the only solid foundation for future hope. Death is not the end. Every human is of eternal significance, and we will all be raised to new life. There will be a judgment when justice will be done. God's people will enjoy and serve him forever in the new heavens and new earth. And so we recognize when people are outraged at what Christians have done, right? And they rightly should be outraged when Christians do wrong. In fact, Christians, Scripture often calls Christians to a higher standard. Those who teach are called to a higher standard of how they live and how they act and how they operate, because we recognize what is true and we have a clear picture and understanding of how we're called to live and to treat people. And so we absolutely should be outraged when wrong, injustice takes place. But what I want to encourage you with here is that the response then is not to say that Christianity is not good, or to say that the world would be better if Christianity didn't exist. Instead, the response should be something to the effect of, that is wrong. That contradicts the way that Scripture is calling this Christian to live. And so how do we then go about in calling them to repentance and calling them to live rightly and consistently? And so when we've seen Christians throughout human history acting on biblical principles, advancing human rights and leading the abolishment of slavery and securing women's rights and children's rights, establishing modern education, establishing modern medicine, modern charity, the foundations of the modern scientific revolution, and shaping the arts and entertainment, how can we then say that Christianity is not good for the world? We may not like some of the rules that it is calling us to, but again, if the question is if that's how I've been designed to live, then that is what is going to lead to the best flourishing and fulfillment. And when we reject that, it's going to lead to us being hurt. I think we see examples of that. So let me leave you with 4 questions that come from a book that John Stone Street wrote, co-authored with someone else, called Restoring All Things, or something like that. But he asked these questions like, okay, Christians, like, how can we go about creating change in culture? And he asked these 4 questions. Number 1, what good can you protect? What good around you is happening that you can say, I want to protect that, promote it, and celebrate it to make sure it keeps happening? Because if we don't protect and promote and celebrate good things, it's possible that then people don't think, oh, maybe that's not something people care for, and they do away with it. So what good is around you in your family, church, school, work, city, wherever it is, that you can celebrate, promote, and protect? Number 2, what is missing that you can contribute? How can you put your God-given mind to use and think innovatively and think, hey, this is not taking place, but man, if this thing was happening, that would make this place a better place. And so what is missing that you can contribute? Number 3, what is evil that you can stop? What is happening around you that should not be? What is your in-group doing? What is your city doing? What is around you that you need to actually stand up and say, rather than, hey, my comfort is the biggest thing for me, which often it's like, I could go out there, but at the same time, ooh, that's a real thing that I fight, and I think we fight. Say, hey, I want to actually stop this, because stopping this evil thing would make the world a better place. And then lastly, what is broken that you can fix? What is not functioning well that if fixed would actually be so much better? What is good that you can protect, missing that you can contribute, evil that you can stop, and broken that you can fix? And I think that if we actually focus on these and do these 4 things, or at least one at a time, we really would be living out the calling or the teachings of the Christian worldview, biblical principles, and show that Christianity really is good for the world. So all that to say, I found this short 39-page booklet from Crossway, Sharon James, Is Christianity Good for the World? I found this really good. It was very insightful. There's a ton of stories and evidence in here. And so if you are looking for a short, concise, but well-researched answer to this question for yourself or to give, I found that very good. So I posted the link in YouTube below. So with that, let me jump to the one question that came in so far. And then if there's other questions, if you're watching, post them or call in. But this question came in of why does God seem so hidden? Let me just say this, as my throat is getting dry and all I brought was coffee. I think there's a reality. Or let me put it this way. I think that question is a really good question. I've often said that, it's often said that the problem of evil is the toughest objection or question when it comes to Christianity. I really think that this question of divine hiddenness, why does God seem so hidden, is like a subset of the problem of evil, but I think even more difficult. I think it is tough because it hits home in such a real way. Now I have a whole show on this question that if you want to check out, I guess I'll make it pop up over here in the corner after we're done. This is something that I experience, right? When I'm praying and it doesn't seem like God is answering my prayers. And it's like, God, I know you could just heal my child. I know you could just take this cough away, this sickness away. I know you could help him do whatever. Why not? Where are you, God? Why don't you just show up? It's something that he could instantly do. And so the fact that he doesn't does lead to this kind of this deep longing and question of like, where are you? And so there's a real personal aspect to this question and objection that makes it really tough. It absolutely does. At the same time, there are intellectual responses that I think are hugely important as we think through this, that should inform and ground our emotional response to this sort of question of why doesn't God respond? And I think it's reasonable to ask, why does God seem so hidden? But I think you could also flip it around and say, why has God made his existence as obvious as it is? Right? God could have really hidden himself even more. Right. So I remember one of the very first times I ever responded to this argument in the conversation on Twitter, back when it was Twitter, with an atheist. It was like, why does God seem so hidden? And I posted a picture of like, I think this is what the hiddenness of God looks like. And it was a child playing, hide and go seek, where they were hiding under a couch cushion with their legs sticking out from under it. And I think it's this idea of like, if you're playing hide and go seek with someone who is really good at hiding and they could absolutely perfectly obscure everything about him, so where you walk right by and there's no way that you knew that they were there. God could have done that. God could have maybe created the world in a way and being distant and inactive from the world in which really it was very difficult to understand that he was present. But when we see from a Christian view, answering this as a Christian, the way in which God created and designed and fine-tuned the universe, the way he built morality into the universe, the way he gave us a conscience to understand and know right from wrong, and then his speaking and revealing himself to us in Scripture, and ultimately in the person of Jesus Christ, God taking on human flesh and dwelling among us, then the question is, well, why did God do so much? Why has he made his existence so obvious? And I get why when it seems like he can show up and doesn't, that deep question hits us of, God, where are you? But I think we also need to recognize the times in our life when God has made his existence clear and obvious to go, wow, you didn't have to. And he didn't have to give us 66 books of the Bible and reveal himself. And he didn't have to come down in the person of Jesus Christ and dwell among us, right? Emmanuel, God with us. That's amazing. Can we let that encourage us? And so God is not just standing in front of us playing hide and go seek, waving his arm saying, I'm right here. Look, 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 here I am. But he has not obscured himself in such a way that it's near impossible to find him. Instead, he's kind of like a child playing hide and go seek, standing behind the curtains or under the pillow with legs fully sticking out. Or one time I was playing hide and go seek with my nephew and he was really little and he just took a blanket and threw it over himself. And I walk in the living room and there's just clearly a child sitting there with the blanket over him. It's like, well, I can't see my nephew, but how confident am I that my nephew is sitting there? 100%, right? We recognize that there's a hiddenness, but there's also an obviousness. So I think sometimes we need to maybe step back and reflect a little bit on the ways that God has revealed himself in our lives, in Scripture, in the world around us. The second thing I think we have to stop and think about when it comes to this question is why do we expect more? Why do I want more? I remember, talking to individuals where it's like, man, I want God to do a miracle in my life. And I'm like, absolutely, that would be great and amazing. And I pray for miracles. I'm not against that. But if I have to have my own personal miracle before I believe, before I trust, then in a sense, I kind of come back to this question is like, am I saying that the miracle of the resurrection is not enough? Am I saying that what God has done, sending the person of Jesus Christ to die and rise from the dead, and the historical evidence to support that claim, is that not enough? Why do I want more? Why does it have to be just for me? Why can't it be something more general to get me to accept this claim? And then the question, like with that, like what would be enough? Like, think about this biblically. Jesus stood right in front of people, did miracles, and rather than believing, they figured out how to kill him. Jesus rose Lazarus from the dead, and then people plotted how they were going to get rid of the evidence, right? Get rid of Jesus, right? Like, why do we think that we are also these incredibly open-minded individuals where if there was just a little bit more evidence or enough evidence, that then I obviously would believe? When we see people standing in front of Jesus, him doing miracles, and many believe, but some did not. Why do we think that we would be different? And just clearly I would believe if there was just more evidence. So here's the way that I kind of look at this intellectually and try to make sense of this question is, does God reveal himself enough? Does God give enough evidence to where our beliefs are justified? Here's what I talked about in the show a couple weeks ago on the nature of faith, right? Am I expected to have an unrational or an unreasonable faith, right? As a Christian, do I have to believe contrary to evidence? No. Right? God has not created the world in such a way that contradicts then the way that then he reveals himself to us. Whereas to be a Christian, I have to believe contrary to evidence. I don't think Christianity calls us to an unrational faith or unrational beliefs. Do I have to have a blind faith? Do I have to believe in spite of evidence? And I don't think so. I think that what we have is that God has given us enough evidence. He's revealed himself to us enough to where our beliefs can be justified, to where you can say, look, I believe that God exists, and here is evidence to support that claim. I believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and here is evidence to support that claim, right? This is what we have before us. And so I think that the question is, has God given us enough? I think the answer is yes. We have enough to justify our beliefs. Now, a professor I had in graduate school when I was taking Why Does God Allow Evil, Dr. Clay Jones, said, God has given enough evidence so that our beliefs may be justified, but not so much evidence that we would have to feign loyalty to God. Right? God has not made his existence so obvious that people have to believe in him. Right? Could God have stuck a flaming sword? This is what he used to say. Could God have stuck a flaming sword up in the sky that every time someone like sinned or did wrong, the sword would come down and chop him in half, and then some voice said, I am God, I exist, believe in me. Like, God could have done that. How many people would believe in God in that world? Everyone, right? Or nearly everyone. How many people would be worshipers of God in that world? How many would say, I love you, versus I'm afraid of you. You're going to do something, cut me in half if I mess up. And so I think that we have to recognize this idea that there's enough evidence that our beliefs can be justified, but not so much that our beliefs, that we have to feign our loyalty to God, that we have to believe in him. Because what God ultimately desires, and it goes back to this original question, what is God's desire? If his desires for every single person to have to believe in him, well then yes, make maybe his existence more obvious. But if his desires for people to choose to be in a relationship with him, as we talked about before, of this Christianity not having this force your beliefs. I haven't made this connection until just right now. Isn't that interesting? We often want God to present himself in a way that almost causes or forces everyone to believe that it's so obvious. Yet at the same time, we want freedom to live and act and believe as we want. And we don't like it when Christians bash us over the head with the Bible or use coercion or force to cause us to believe. Maybe that's a little bit of an inconsistency that we can play around with and kind of pull some strings on if you're in a conversation. Okay, so you don't want people to force you. You want to be able to make a free choice to believe or not believe. Yes. Well, isn't that what God has given you? Now, maybe they would say, no, there's no evidence for God. And so I want something so that I can make a more rational choice. I think that faith is blind. And now you have to have that question of what do they mean by evidence and all that kind of stuff. But I think that what we recognize is, what is God's goal? God's goal is for us to freely come into a relationship with him. Is the way that he has revealed himself to us, does that complete that goal? are people able to come to a free relationship with him? Well, yeah, Christianity is the largest religion of the world, like over 2 billion people. So clearly, God is doing something that people are believing and trusting in. And then secondly, and lastly, if God gave more evidence, would that mean more people believe? Or if God's, as scripture says, that God desires for people to come to him, God desires for all people to be saved, do we really think that God's saying, man, I want more people to believe? And I know if I did this, that more would believe freely, but I'm just still not going to do it. Or do we trust that God created the best of all possible worlds and the world in which the most number of people freely come to knowledge of him do? And this goes back to what we discussed a few weeks ago on the show, is to claim that I somehow know better than God, or this is the way God should have done it, this would have worked better, is in one sense to claim to know better than the God who knows best. And I just don't think that's the case. And so there is a level of faith where I trust God. When he says he desires for all people to believe, and that God created the world in the best possible way, that I trust that this is the best, and the way that he's revealed himself is the best. And that maybe on the surface, I may think that doing something different would have caused more people to freely believe, but how would I know that? How do I know what is truly in human hearts at the end of the day, and what would cause them to believe or not believe? And so I think that while this question of why God seems so hidden hits home deeply, is a tough one to deal with, I think there are intellectual truths that we can rest on to say, man, God does care. He hears us. We are loved by him. We are his children. There are so many truths in scripture that we can fall back on and say, God, I trust that you've done this best. And thank you for giving us what you have given us. And thank you for revealing yourself to us. Thank you for sending your son, Jesus Christ, for us to die and rise from the dead for the forgiveness of sins. Like, that is amazing. And rather than just being, oh, why can't I have more? To fall back and say, God, thank you for what you have done, and help me trust in you. And so that's kind of where I fall. Doesn't mean that the emotional, difficult seasons don't happen, but I think it does ground us to where maybe those difficult lows are not lower, and we kind of stay more middle ground, resting in a confidence of what God has done. So with all that said, I don't see any other questions that have come in. There's the book. Is Christianity Good for the World? I highly recommend it. I thought it was very insightful, very good read. Hopefully this conversation was encouraging to you. Hopefully it gave you some information that you can kind of put into practice if you're in a conversation and people claim that Christians are so heaven-minded they don't care about this world. Well, that's just not true. Look at all the things that Christians have done in this world. Or Christians are just one issue focused. They don't care about these other things. No, Christians care about all these things, and that's why a lot of them are grounded in a Christian worldview. Or Christians hold theology that's destructive. No, Christians hold a theology that maybe limits what you should do, but that's based on your design. And so we do have to take this question back to say, okay, what limitations, what restrictions upon me are there by design and should not be overcome, versus what sort of issues are there as a consequence of the fall that we should use our technology to overcome? So all that to say, thanks for being here. Let me just say this is, we are in a time of fundraising, and this happens sometimes in the middle of the year if the funding doesn't come in to get us through the end of the year. And so we have a shortfall now of only about $7,000 to get to the end of the year in the black. And so if you want to come alongside and support this ministry, if it's been an encouragement, a blessing to you, if you see the value of this for the church and for Christians to engage in better conversations and dialogue and want to consider giving, you can go to think-well.org/donate. There's also a link in the description on YouTube below, so you can go there and check that out, as well as you can be praying for me tomorrow. I'm going up to Hume SoCal to talk to students up there, as well as I'm starting to write my doctoral research in August, and hopefully have it done by the end of August, because I have a chapter for a book coming out on technology that's due September 4. And so for the next month, I'm going to be reading and writing like crazy. I've been reading like crazy, and I'm going to start writing. So you can be praying for me as I write my research out and write this chapter, that I can get that done, as well as hopefully continue to come along and provide content for you. And so next week, I will be back with a conversation from the next chapter of my book by atheist Armin Navabi on his reasons why there is no know God. I forget what the next chapter is, but you can look for that next Tuesday in the live stream around 1 or 2 p.m. is when I try to shoot to do them each week. So with that, thanks for being here today. If you want other shows that are going to pop up on the side to encourage you to think about the Christian faith and about our culture so you can engage the culture well, you can do that. And share this, like it. If this has been encouraging, share it with a friend and help kind of spread the word. That would mean a lot to me. But until next time, see you all later. Continue thinking deeply about God, Christianity, and Jesus, because they are worth thinking about. Have a good day, everybody. Bye.